If you belong to the social elite, if you have a violent streak in you, tinged with a somewhat idealized view of the world, then being a medieval knight is the career path for you. A knight is a word of Anglo-Saxon origin. The Anglo-Saxon word is actually knechtas, which means simply a youth or retainer. From the time of the Norman Conquest onwards, however, it signified a warrior who fought on horseback. The Anglo-Saxons didn't fight on horseback, as we saw in a previous lecture. Only foot soldiers fought at the Battle of Hastings, whereas the Normans had horse warriors as well. The Norman word for horse warrior was chevalier, from which our word chivalry derives. Chivalry originally means knights on horseback or the knightly class, but over time it came to mean the qualities expected of a knight: honor, courage, and courtesy. Knights were a vital part of medieval society because, in theory at least, they offered protection to those who were vulnerable, to the other side of history, so that's why they belong in our course. They were both admired and feared. It's because of his status that Chaucer gives his knight, his knecht, pride of place in the Canterbury Tales by making him the first of his storytellers. A knecht there was, and that a worthy man, that fra the time that he first began to ridden out, he loved chivalry, truth and honour, freedom and courtesy. What a wonderful description. My values exactly. Courtesy, of course. After enumerating all the campaigns in which he served against the so-called heathens, aka the Muslims, Chaucer pays the knight this glowing tribute. And though that he were worthy, he was wise. In other words, he was both courageous and wise. And he concludes with this wonderful line, which always moves me deeply: he was a very parfit, gentle knecht. It's an idealized portrait, of course. Knights, like the rest of humanity, were capable of great cruelty. We're all familiar with the image of the knight in shining armor, riding around, saving damsels in distress. I'm sorry to say he didn't exist, nor did damsels in distress exist either, for that matter. So what we're going to do in this lecture is examine the reality behind that confected image. In effect, protecting the weak was just a sideline at best. The main job of a knight was to fight in battle, and there was a great demand for soldiers in the Middle Ages. The wars known as the Crusades lasted for 3 centuries. We'll talk about them later. The 100 Years' War between England and France lasted from 1337 to 1453, well over 100 years, in fact. And then there were the constant squabbles between rival barons, each of whom had his private army incorporating a number of knights. Below the barons came the knights' bannerets. These were knights who led their own companies of commoners under their own banner, hence their name, banneret. And below the knights' bannerets were the knights' bachelor, ordinary knights who fought under someone else's banner. Knights, in other words, were professional soldiers. They offered their services to their superiors, who rewarded them with land, which peasants then cultivated on their behalf. They also depended for their livelihood on the ransom and plunder they obtained from war, as well as on the prizes they earned in tournaments. There were other knights who, instead of serving their lord, belonged to an order of knighthood, rather as monks belonged to different orders. The first order of knighthood to be founded was the Knights Hospitaller in 1099, very soon after Jerusalem had been captured in the First Crusade. The Knights Hospitaller took their name from the fact that they were attached to a hospital in Jerusalem to protect sick and injured pilgrims. The next order to be founded were the Knights Templar in 1119. The Templars were named for the fact that the headquarters of their order was on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the high platform where once had stood the great temple built by Herod and destroyed by the Romans, as we saw earlier. Their official title was the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ. And to emphasize their poverty, their seal depicted two knights riding on a single horse. So we find here, in theory at least, a commitment to the simple life. So, you want to become a knight. Let me warn you, it's every bit as tough as becoming a US Marine. You also have to be of noble birth, preferably the eldest son of a knight himself. There's another problem. You have to start your training at around the age of 7, which probably rules out most patrons of the great courses. If you're not the eldest son, by the way, you'll probably enter the church. That's another way to become rich and powerful. If you do fit the criteria I've just listed, however, your father will pack you off to a nobleman's house, perhaps to a relative like an uncle, where you'll serve as his page. You'll learn how to ride, how to behave in polite society, and how to fight with a wooden sword. You'll also learn how to carry a lady's train so it doesn't touch the ground. Very important that. We see pages doing their stuff at royal weddings and coronations. Then, around the age of 14, you'll become a squire. That's to say, you'll become the personal attendant of a knight. The word squire comes from the French écuyer, meaning shield carrier, because that was one of your main duties, carrying a knight's shield and spear. You have to look after your knight's horse and armor and serve him his meat at the table when he's feasting. You also learn courtly manners and how to conduct yourself in the presence of ladies. It all sounds very proper, but boys will be boys, and some squires did go off the rails. We hear of rival gangs of squires burning down half of Boston, a town on the east coast of England, in 1288. Your training now includes fighting with a sword and buckler. A buckler was a small round shield, throwing the javelin, putting, as it's called, or throwing stones, fighting with quarterstaves, and so on. You fight alongside your knight in battle and assist him if he's wounded. At the end of your period of training, at about 21, you're ready to be knighted yourself. This is a very solemn ceremony. First, you fast and pray in the chapel. Then you make your confession to a priest and kneel before your Lord, or perhaps before your king, in full armor, but without your helmet on. You swear an oath of loyalty, which includes the words, "Sire, I become your man." Your Lord then dubs you a knight by laying his sword briefly on each of your shoulders and on your neck. This symbolizes the fact that he could, if he chose, take your life. He also presents you with a white sword belt, a token of your purity, and a pair of gold spurs. You now carry the arms and wear the protective chain-mail armor of a knight. Plate armor, by the way, didn't replace chainmail until the beginning of the 15th century, outside the period that we're looking at. Chainmail consists of open rings interlinked with others that are then closed with rivets. Underneath your chainmail, you wear a padded garment. Over it, you wear a surcoat or tunic with a hole that you slip over your head. Your most important weapon is your double-edged sword, which you use for cutting. You also have a dagger to slash your opponent's face or cut his throat, and a mace to clobber him with. You carry a lance when you're on horseback. You ride a high war horse called a charger that's capable of carrying you fully clad in armour, together with a high saddle and a pair of stirrups. Hence our expression, to get on your high horse, meaning to push people around. Ordinary folk just rode on ponies. The best kind of war horse was the destrier, from the Latin dextarius, which is perhaps a reference to the fact that your squire, when he leads your horse on foot, stands to the right of it. The closest modern equivalent is a Spanish Andalusian. If you're really well off, your horse will have armour as well. The commonest protection for a war horse was the chafron, which covered his head. To uphold the dignity of your calling, you'll have at least one squire and one servant in attendance. If you happen to be a baron, you'll have a large retinue of knights, squires, heralds, valets, and servants, numbering perhaps as many as 50 or more. And last but not least, you'll need your own heraldic coat of arms. A coat of arms is a device that's painted on your shield, embroidered on your surcoat, and emblazoned on your banner. Your son will inherit your coat of arms when you die. The choice of colours and motifs was strictly regulated, and the language used to describe the pattern is Old French. So, or is used for gold, argent for silver, gules for red, and so on and so forth. A lion or a boar, for instance, that is shown lying down is described as couchant, or if it's looking back, as regardons, and so forth. You also have a motto, such as son tâche, my motto. Originally, knights could choose their own coat of arms. Over time, however, coats of arms became standardized. The original purpose of a coat of arms was probably to enable you to be identified on the battlefield and at tournaments. That's because your helmet covers your entire face. And as a further mark of identification, you wear a crest on your helmet. You're extremely fit, as fit, if not more so, as any of the soldiers we've met in this course thus far. A stirring example of knightly athleticism is recorded in the case of a Frenchman called Marshal Boucicaut, who could vault onto his horse in full armour. I don't recommend trying the exercise except under heavy supervision. Another more chilling proof of athleticism is recorded in the case of King Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. He was said to be able to slice through a man's skull right the way down to his teeth with a single blow of his sword. Since knighthood was an international organization, you might well find yourself fighting under the banner of a foreigner, especially if you were fighting in one of the Crusades. The medieval church sought to harness all that knightly testosterone to its own advantage. It was a knight's duty to fight for God. Chaucer's knight campaigned for the church in Spain, Turkey, Egypt, and Lithuania. Medieval battles were highly ritualized affairs governed by strict rules of conduct. For instance, you'd be expected to act with courtesy, that word again, towards the enemy once you had taken him prisoner. That was one of the reasons why you wore a distinctive coat of arms. It would indicate that you were wealthy and therefore worth ransoming. And if you did get captured, you could expect to be kept in comfortable surroundings before being ransomed. I need hardly point out that the same courtesy was not extended to common soldiers. No one would fork out money to ransom an ordinary soldier. Sometimes, too, when you were fighting, so-called lists replaced battles. The word list describes an enclosure where a battle was settled by combat between specially chosen knights. One of the two warring sides would challenge the other to select its best knights, typically about 10 in number on each side. and the two opposing groups would then fight to the death. It was obviously a great honor to be chosen to fight in the lists, since the fate of the conflict depended on you alone. Another way you could gain prestige and fame was by participating in a tournament. In earlier times, tournaments involved two teams of knights who would fight against each other on a field several miles long, assisted by foot soldiers. This was known as a melee. From the mid-1330s onwards, however, tournaments took the form of solo jousts. That's to say, combats between single pairs of knights on horseback. By the way, there isn't any evidence for the belief that knights had to be lowered onto their horses by means of winches. That idea seems to have been an invention of Mark Twain in a Connecticut Yankee at King Arthur's court. You wear a so-called frog-mouthed helmet to give added protection to your head by deflecting a direct spear thrust away from the neck and face, since the top and bottom of the helmet meet at an angle. The slit for the eyes is very narrow, so that pieces of shattered wood from one of the lances doesn't hit you in the face. You and your opponent take up your positions some distance away from each other and then charge towards each other at full tilt. A full tilt is a metaphor that derives from jousting. A tilt was a prong that was attached to your breastplate at the place where you rested and steadied your lance. To prevent head-on collisions, there's a so-called tilt barrier to separate the paths down which the horses gallop towards each other. In earlier times, there was only a rope that hung a few feet off the ground. Let's suppose now you're a spectator at a tournament. People of all social classes, women as well as men, enjoyed watching tournaments. Brightly coloured banners billow in the breeze from poles attached to the stands where you sit, indicating the coats of arms of the contestants. The air is tense with excitement. The nobles are decked out in all their finery. Before the tournament begins, all the knights parade before your gaze beside the tilt, accompanied by their banner bearers. After that, there's a fanfare of trumpets, followed by a proclamation from the herald announcing the first joust. The first pair of mounted knights enters the lists, seated on their high saddles, flaunting their coats of arms. The horses whinny and snort and paw the ground impatiently. As a spectator, you feel the same kind of thrill that anyone feels who has watched a sport or an entertainment that could result in a death of one of the participants. A kerchief is dropped, just as at a Roman gladiatorial contest, and as it flutters to the ground, both knights dig their spurs into their horses, drawing blood, and charge towards each other with their steel-tipped spears held horizontally and gripped tightly under their arms, aimed directly at their opponent's breastplate. By the time they close in, their horses are galloping at perhaps as much as 40 miles an hour. At first they miss. In fact, they take several turns before one of them scores a hit and topples his opponent from his horse. It's lucky for him that he does fall off. Otherwise, he might have died instantly from the blow. Perhaps the contest ends there. Alternatively, the combatants continue the fight on foot. They've now discarded their lances and are taking swipes at each other with a heavy broadsword. Their swords are so heavy that they have to clasp them each in both hands. They're sweating profusely inside their armour, not that you can tell, of course. And each time they raise their swords, it takes more effort. In the end, they throw down their swords and start swinging their axes or their maces at each other. It's all very formal. They are allowed a set number of blows with each weapon, and they deliver them alternately. Eventually, one of the knights is struck on the head and falls to the ground. The other one removes the helmet from the fallen knight, but, let us suppose, chivalrously chooses to spare his life. Attendants, called varlets, a variant of the word valet, haul the fallen knight off the field. The victor steps forward to receive the prize from whoever is hosting the tournament. Of course, it's great to win a tournament, but pity the poor loser. He has been publicly humiliated, and in front of ladies too. It's small wonder that the church tried repeatedly to ban jousting, all to no avail. It was far too much fun to watch. But that's not the only reason why jousting was so popular. It was also a highly effective way to keep the cream of one's fighting force in top physical shape. And since women were among the spectators, knights would be under additional pressure to acquit themselves honourably. Talking of women, there's a wonderful story that the English King Edward III was so inspired after witnessing a particularly exciting tournament at Windsor Castle in 1344 that he decided to found a round table of his closest knights in imitation of the legendary round table that had been set up by King Arthur. Edward called his knights the Knights of the Garter, in commemoration of an occasion when his mistress, with whom he was dancing, happened to lose her garter. Edward retrieved the garter and placed it rather suggestively on his leg. There was much sniggering from those who witnessed this act of courtesy, whereupon the king menacingly declared, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," shame to him who evil thinks of this, which hence became the motto of the order. St. George's Chapel in Windsor, a beautiful Gothic chapel, is decorated with the banners of the Knights of the Order of the Garter. It's dedicated to St. George because, as everyone knows, it's the business of a knight to slay dragons, and St. George was famous precisely for that. Being practiced in the arts of war was, so to speak, only half the battle of being a knight. A knight also had to adhere to the code of chivalry, a Norman word, as we saw, that translates as knightliness. So, in what did knightliness consist? Well, no one put it better than Chaucer when he said that the knight, in his Canterbury Tales, loved truth and honour, freedom and courtesy. Courtesy means literally courtliness or courtly behaviour. In other words, the kind of behaviour that was learned and practised at court. A court life in the Middle Ages was extremely refined and sophisticated. There were very precise conventions dictating how you interacted with other people. You had to be immaculately dressed, impeccably groomed, highly cultivated, and graceful in your movements and gestures. You were expected to be accomplished in dancing, drawing, and musicianship. Courtesy, the modern term, isn't a virtue that cuts much ice these days. Some people might even despise it, thinking that it is merely the kind of deference that you pay either to a superior or to a woman that is insincere at best and hypocritical at worst. But in the Middle Ages, courtesy was the mark of a civilized, sophisticated, and moral man, a man who promoted the virtues of truth and honor. I say man because it was predominantly, though not exclusively, a masculine virtue, a central and defining part of the code of chivalry. So how did you manifest this quality? Well, you manifested it in part by looking after those who were defenseless and in need of help, those who were on the other side of history. And this is where the ideal of knighthood commands our special attention. In the book of the Order of Chivalry, which was written by a certain Raymond Lull in 1276, you were expected to defend, I quote, women, widows, orphans, the sick and the weak, and those who work on the land. Well, did knights actually display such admirable virtues to widows, orphans, and the like? Well, sometimes, no doubt, but by no means invariably. Both on the battlefield and off it, infringements of the code of chivalry were commonplace. Some knights scorned those who were weak and defenseless, were foul-mouthed and abusive towards women, and acted brutally towards their enemies. There's a story even that some of the knights who participated in the First Crusade went so far as to eat the bodies of their enemies. If we want to be thoroughly cynical, we could, with some justification, say that knighthood merely provided an outlet for man's natural tendency for violence, and worse, that it justified that tendency by dressing it up in fine-sounding language. The age of chivalry lasted from about 1100 to 1500. Long before that, however, knights in armour were becoming militarily obsolete. Chaucer's knight is already one of a dying breed. It's estimated that in his day there were no more than 1,000 knights in the whole of England, supported by about 3 times as many squires. That was down from 6,000 knights in the reign of Henry II, 1154 to 1189. One of the factors that had brought about a reduction in their ranks was a phenomenon that derived from the other side of history, the common soldier, provided with nothing more sophisticated than a longbow and a quiver full of arrows. The first battle to be decided by the longbow was Crécy in 1346, which the English won against the French. It's been estimated that in the first 5 minutes of the battle, the English bowmen were able to unleash 5,000 arrows, thereby creating havoc in the ranks of French knights. The French bowmen were armed with the crossbow, a much more powerful weapon. Whereas the range of the longbow is about 500 feet, the range of a crossbow is 3 times as great. To draw the crossbow, however, you have to hold it down on the ground with your foot while pulling the string with your hands as you straighten your legs. You hold the string taut by a catch, which you release by pulling a kind of trigger, just like a gun. The problem was that whereas the longbowman could fire off about 10 arrows a minute, a crossbowman could manage only about 2 or 3. Archery, as we'll see in the lecture on relaxation and entertainment in the Middle Ages, was an important pastime among men and women of all classes. It spelt the end of the age of chivalry and the new dominance of the common soldier in battle. So was knighthood all bad? Was chivalry all bad? Of course not. Though I should like to hear from the other side of history, and notably the people who expected protection from their knights. I'd also like to hear from the so-called infidels from whom they wrested the Holy Land in the wars we call the Crusades, the wars which are the subject of the next lecture.